Hey, we're off. Oh, can I shut this down? Right. So this is about Africans in early modern England. And I mean, most people think that black people arrived in this country on the Windrush in 1948. And before that, there was none, but it's not true. Just before we start, I'll just sort of say that the Tudors described Africans in various ways, but none of it is because of they had confusion about where Africans came from, where they originated. So they called them different things like Blackamoor, Negro, Ethiopian, etc. But it doesn't mean what it means these days when people call it was just a description that they come up with. Oh, there we go. So the first, we'll go back a bit, and the first Africans in England were Afro-Romans. There was in Cumbria, an altar stone was found, and in the foundations of an old cottage, carved into it was an inscription dedicated to the god Jupiter. And it recorded that sometime between 253 and 258 CE, a unit of Aurelian Moors had been stationed in the nearby Roman fortress of Albalva. Aurelian is just the name of the commander. So it was a Moorish regiment, or Moorish, whatever they call it, century. Then we have the ivory bangle lady. In Roman York, they studied two different burial sites. One of them was to bury the poor, and the other the wealthier residents. And it suggested that 11 to 12% of York at that time had been on African descent, and that they moved in all levels of society. In 1901, a stone sarcophagus was discovered. And when the skull was analysed, archaeologists found that the skeleton was of a young woman, most probably from North Africa, and was nicknamed the Ivory Bangle Lady. The sarcophagus was found amongst other graves, but hers contained the most riches, so it's presumed she would have been a rich woman who held high status in a diverse city, with archaeologists suggesting that Roman York was more diverse than modern day York. Then we had the beachy head woman. This was second or third century Afro-Roman, who was probably brought up in the south of England and was either been born in that region or had been brought there very young, possibly from Africa. Her teeth were in good condition. She enjoyed a healthy diet, and she was discovered laid out carefully in her grave. So it suggests that the life she had was not a lowly servant life or a slave or anything like that, that she was a fairly high-ranking woman. Now, with the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century, to the beginning of Europe's age of exploration in the 15th century, the British Isles were largely cut off from Africa and Africans. Then we had what's called the Reconquista. That was when the Christian, what would you call them? Do we call them Spanish these days? Reconquered from about 900 the Iberian Peninsula. It had been under Islamic caliphates for hundreds of years before that. And what happened is, as they conquered them, African descendants who lived there became part of the entourage of foreign ambassadors and royalty. So they came with Spanish ambassadors to Northern European countries. Others came as merchants, and some in service to Spanish merchants. And then there was the other Africans. As you can see there, the map of Africa in a short while, 90 years, goes from very vague with guesswork, I suppose, into a quite sophisticated map at the end with pictures of different Africans. And diplomats from Africa used to come to European courts. The kings of the Congo were the first to make contact in Lisbon. And the sons of elite Congolese families went to Portugal to further their education. There were enslaved Africans in Europe at this time, but slavery at that time was not based on race. White and other ethnic groups were also enslaved. Many Africans had certain highly prized skills, and that meant that even those who were initially in service were able to gain their independence and freedom and become sought after craftsmen and artisans and become an integral part of society. So I'm going to look at a few of these Africans who became part of Tudor society. The first one is John Blank. He probably arrived in England in 1501 as part of the entourage of Catherine of Aragon. Historians have speculated that Blank might be an example of Tudor ironic humour, like a comic play on the words based around blanco or blanc, meaning white in Spanish and French. He makes his first appearance in the records in 1509 when a note records wages being paid to him by the court of Henry VIII. He is the first Black person in Britain for whom we have not just a name, but an image, and there it is. This came about because Blank performed at celebrations that were staged in January 1511 to mark the birth of Prince Henry, the son born to Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. The festivities were recorded on a Westminster tournament roll. John Blank appears twice on that roll, shown on both occasions with within the procession riding a grey horse and wearing an identical livery as the rest of the trumpeters, but with a brown and yellow turban. He was recorded as having been awarded a special payment for performing that tournament. He had also been at the funeral of Henry VII in the spring of 1509. And then later that year, he performed at the coronation of Henry VIII. In 1509, he petitioned Henry VIII requesting that he be awarded the job and wages of a recently deceased fellow trumpeter. And that's some of his words there that he wrote to Henry. He needed sufficient to maintain and keep him and do your grace like service as other trumpeters do. So he obviously could write in English. He promised lifelong service and loyalty as his case for promotion and reward. A later document from 1512 reveals that he got married. We presume to an English woman, nothing is known though. The document records that Blank received a wedding gift from the king, a gown of violet cloth and also a bonnet and a hat to be taken of our gift against his marriage. That's what the king wrote. John Blank's place in the Tudor court was a reflection of the modernity to which the Tudors and English aristocracy aspired. The rest of Europe, by the early 16th century, Africans had become recognised feature, and the Tudors wanted to seem outward-looking cultures like the rest of Europe. And mimicked Renaissance court life and pageantry. And one of those things was a fashion for Black musicians. So John Blank was a man who had marketable skills and talents, and it enabled him to earn a comfortable living. and command a certain degree of social status. The records of him are preserved due to his close proximity to power. I mean, Henry VII and Henry VIII. Most Black Tudors, of course, weren't that fortunate. There's only fragmentary references in parish registers and other documents. Oh yeah, sorry. Next one is Reasonable Black Man. Again, you can see the surname, as it were, reflects who it is. Reasonable Black Man was a silk weaver. He lived in South London. His surname, like I say, reflected his origin, and he was described as a blackamoor in one of its variants on several occasions. He might have invented the forename for himself, much as people with foreign names that are difficult for the English to pronounce change them. Or it may have been his Christian name received at baptism, or it might have just been a nickname that was bestowed on him by his neighbours. He most likely moved to London as part of the influx of refugees from the Netherlands in the 1570s, which, as well as being a centre for his craft, being a silk weaver, was home to a number of Africans due to its connections with Spain and Portugal. In the 16th century, Antwerp, which was then part of the Netherlands, is thought to have the second largest Black population in Europe after Lisbon. So he may well have arrived from there. He had at least 3 children, and we know 2 of them died young in the plague of 1592. His wife again was probably an Englishwoman, because considering the small number of Africans in Elizabethan London. The next one, the needle-making needle. We don't have a name for this chap. He lived in Cheapside between 1553 and 58. And others complained he would never teach his art to none. Basically, he was one of the few people who knew the art of making fine Spanish needles. So he was in high demand. So he weren't going to share his secrets with everybody. He knew a good thing when he had it. But he wasn't the only person of African descent in the needle making profession. There was also a guy called Simon Valencia, known as a blackamoor, who lived in London and was actually his grave is at St. Botolph in Aldgate. He worked as a needle maker, and it seems like he must have come via Spain with his the name he got, Valencia. And at the same time, 2 unnamed African women worked for a hat or band makers in London. And having learned the skills, these 2 African women went on to make opportunities set up on their own. Then we have Mariana. That's not a picture of her. That's just an unidentified Black woman in a painting. We don't have a picture of her, but we do know about her because at that time there was a confusion when Southern European merchants brought people they considered their slaves with them to England. And this is the case with Maria. Her employer was a Genoese merchant, and he tried to sell her as a slave. He tricked her into signing a document to say she was his slave, but she couldn't read it. The document was in English, and she couldn't read or write it, and he basically got her to sign it on a pretense. But it shows the standing that people in the community advised her that the merchant couldn't sell her basically in England. So it ended up in court, and it was judged that she could not be a slave in England, and her master had to pay her a proper wage, give her reasonable time off, and provide proper meals. And moreover, the judgment stated that no person should be regarded as a slave based on the colour of their skin. So that shows that slavery at that time, there was none in England at all. Well, they hadn't been since the Norman times, which is a subject for 2 weeks' time. We have Henry Antonio Getto. Most Africans lived in London and the southern ports, but some actually ended up in small villages and became part of the local community. These Africans were baptized, buried, recorded in parish records in London, Plymouth, Southampton, Barnstable, Bristol, Leicester, blah, blah, blah. Africans are described in Tudor parish records from 1558, which is when most of them official records began. Until well into the 17th century, they were known as blackamoors, Negroes, Ethiopians, Negroes, etc. Meanwhile, in a book called True Discourse, an English traveller and writer, George Best, refers to them as being black as coal, so black that when a fair white English woman engages in a relationship with them, they begat a son in all respects as black as the father was. But many of the parish registers were later transcribed and collated as bishops' transcripts. But then the Victorians came along, and when they went through them, they left out certain details that they didn't like. One of them was ethnic descriptions, and the other one was illegitimate births. Those Victorians. Henry was baptized when he was 26 years old in Holt, a place called Holt, Worcestershire. Early on, he's described as a gardener, Henry Bromley, who was a landowner of the time. Later, though, he's described as a yeoman, and the yeoman was a man who cultivated his own land, was independent. He married a woman called Persida, and they had 5 children together. He also had another child out of wedlock with an unknown woman. What's remarkable about Henry is that there's nothing remarkable about it. His presence in Holt society was seen perfectly natural. And his descendants mainly stayed in Holt and became a significant strata of Holt society. And most of them kept on calling themselves Getto. And it was only in the 18th century that descendants started to call themselves Jetta to distance themselves, because attitudes had obviously changed. But now in the village of Holt in Worcestershire, a lot of the population are actually descendants of Henry and Tony Getto, and they don't even know it. Edward Swalley. Edward Swalley, again, the name gives it away. He arrived in England with Francis Drake after Drake had been raiding the Spanish Caribbean. He found work as a porter in a gentleman's house in Gloucestershire, and he later became the first African in English history to whip a white man. The duties of a Tudor's gentleman porter were closer to those of an Oxbridge College porter or an apartment block concierge. He was the first person visitors met at the gate or lodge of the manor, and so their first impression of the household. And so it was considered an important post. The man he was employed by was Sir Edward Winter. Winter had a reputation for violence, having killed a man in a duel, fought against the Spanish Armada, raided the Caribbean with Francis Drake, and spent imprisonment in France after he'd followed the wars on the continent. Yeah, despite all this, in 1597, he was serving as a justice of the peace. Winter summoned his highest standing servant, one of his highest standing servants, John Guy, to appear before them in the Great Hall at his manor. And his intention was to humiliate Guy and accuse him of gross negligence. And he called on Edward Swalley to beat him. The assembled company were shocked as Guy was soundly whipped. The whipping was considered shocking and even unchristian-like, but not for the reason that you might think. It was acceptable, even normal, for a Tudor gentleman to inflict corporal punishment on his servant. But the people of the area were stunned when such a well-educated, high-status servant was publicly humiliated. That was the shocking bit, not the fact that it was administered by Edward Swalley, a black man. Jacques Francis. He was employed as a diver to help recover the cannons and other equipment from the Mary Rose, which had sunk in 1545. He was born in the 1520s on an island off the coast of West Africa. It's not known how he came to England, but it's probably via his employer's home city of Venice. Most Tudor sailors didn't know how to swim. It was thought to be unlucky and of little use, and ships were not in the habit of changing course to rescue those who fell overboard. The reasoning was it was better to drown quickly. Africans, on the other hand, could swim, and many of them were expert divers. Jacques was also the first known African to give evidence in an English court of law. His employer had been accused of stealing from other wrecks he was salvaging, and Jacques was called to testify. This was objected to by the accusers on the basis that he was a slave and slaves could not testify. The evidence is, though, that although he might have started life as a slave, in England he was not, was paid a wage. This confusion, as I said, has happened in other occasions, because the laws in England were very different from Southern Europe. So if we do look at the Mary Rose, which Jacques was diving for, what's interesting about that is that a few years ago, Channel 4 commissioned a documentary on the Mary Rose. And the main purpose of the documentary was to examine how they tried to refloat it at the time, etc. And they went down and dived and looked at what was left down there, the guns and etc. But they also decided to examine 8 skeletons of sailors who drowned on the ship. And what they found surprised them, and they had to change the nature of the documentary, because 8 of the 4, out of the 8, 4 were not English. And out of those 4, 2 were of mixed African descent. So you know, a quarter, it could, you could say that a quarter of the crew of the Mary Rose were actually of African descent, which is not unusual. I mean, people think that the English Navy has always been crewed by Englishmen, but it's not true. Right up to Nelson and all that, there was plenty of foreign or African or whatever crewmen, sailors. So this is just a quick thing about the Tudors. Ethnicity was more akin to what we call nationality today. People in Tudor times saw the English, Welsh, French, Spanish, etc. as different ethnicities. And the ruling Tudor dynasty was very aware of their own heritage. Their family were basically Welsh and French, and they knew that Henry VII's claim to the throne was very weak, to say the least. And there was probably other claimants with a better claim, you know. And so what they did is try to choose marriages to cement alliances and strengthen their position. So that's why the marriage of Catherine of Aragon to Henry, etc. He was trying to build up more legitimacy. So that's why the Tudors were very, very interested in ethnicity as they saw it. But when it came to race, there were different explanations. The conception of skin color and race was very different. One theory was the biblical explanation. Basically, that all kinds of humans descended from the three sons of Noah. Shem's descendants received Asia. They went to Asia. Ham's, Africa, and Japheth's, Europe, roughly. And then added on to this was a further theory suggested that there was 72 races paralleling the 72 apostles sent out by Jesus according to the Gospel of Luke. Moreover, they thought most races, or what they call races, had certain founders, like Scotta, the daughter of Pharaoh, who was ancestress of the Scots, or Brutus the Trojan, who gave his name to Britain, from whom all Britons descended. And these various strands, the three sons of Noah, the 72 races, and the ancestors, could be combined into a complete family tree of all humanity. This points to sort of idiosyncrasy in medieval genealogical idiom. But while the starting point, a premise of such a genealogical ethnic thinking was that each race was a group of human beings of common biological descent, the specific biblically inspired form it took also maintained the common biological descent of all human beings, from Adam and Eve and from Noah and his wife. In St. Augustine's words, as there, whoever is anywhere born a man, that is a rational mortal animal, no matter what unusual appearance he presents, no Christian can doubt that he springs from that one protoplast. If they are human, they are descendant from Adam. So that's a different interpretation that came later. But there was other considerations when it came to classifying humans. Two of the most significant were the importance of environmental influence and the emphasis on cultural and social components of ethnicity. So you get the environmental explanation of race. One of its founding texts was the Hippocratic Airs, Waters and Places. In general, you will find assimilated to the nature of the land both the physique and the characteristics of its inhabitants, So basically the belief was that climate and geography shaped how you looked. Race and ethnicity characteristics of different people, depending on where they lived. It wasn't value free though, because usually it turned out that the best environment and the one with the most desirable results was wherever the person saying it lived. So there you see some quotes. Human beings vary in appearance and colour according to the skies above them. Cold is the mother of whiteness and paleness, as heat is the mother of blackness and redness, etc. So there's some of the ideas that are coming out. And skin colour lent itself to this explanation. The third, it was all to do with the heat of the sun and how much they were. to give you the colour of the skin. They thought at the time, over the course of generations, blacks in cold climates would become white, and vice versa. It was also believed that if a black couple had a child in Europe, it would be born white, while a white couple child born in Africa would be black. What's clear though, I mean, it sounds very confused. These ideas did change when the evidence contradicted them. When Africans started to appear more in Europe and didn't turn white. So then there was the cultural explanation. Ethnicity was defined by and manifested in culture as much as or more than descent. The classic definition was from a guy, Regino of Prum. The various nations differ in descent, customs, language, and law. So of those things he said, only one is biological, descent. Customs, language, and law are the outcome of socialization, and hence are changeable. That was absolutely the thinking of customs, language, and law was a standard part of thinking of early modern European authors when it came to describing ethnic identity. Race was not a central organizing concept of intellectual life or political culture during the early modern era. During the age of European expansion, when so many indigenous people of the New World and transported slaves from Africa suffered at the hands of white Europeans, white domination didn't rest on theories of white racial superiority. Other arguments, whether derived from Christian imperative to spread the word of God through missions to the heathens, or theories of natural law concerning the connection between the proper use of land and the rights to its ownership, they were the things that were used to justify European superiority and expropriation. Racial identity was subliminal. Whites conquered or took over the rest of parts of Africa and South America without any overt ideology of white superiority. But although there wasn't a doctrinal racism in early modern Europe, it didn't mean that racial prejudice was absent. Racist attitude existed, but significantly didn't rest on any clearly articulated theories of racial difference. Race, ethnicity, and even national consciousness was a matter of second order importance behind the primary commitment to church and the allegiance to a monarch. So political and religious alignments were more prominent than ethnic or racial identities. The English had a long history of separating themselves from others and treating foreigners, such as the Irish, as alien, others, and the continued persecution of the Jews in Europe, a long-standing attitude. But these forms of early modern racism cannot be explained in terms of modern explanations about their sources, expressions, or character. There was sort of an intellectual limit to racial consciousness. So, what happened next with was black slavery inevitable? Anybody who assumes that all Africans in British history have been powerless, enslaved victims, are wrong. Black Tudors actively pursued their own interests and were free to do so. We find them petitioning for payment of wages, pay rises, guarding trade secrets, to retain a monopoly, seeking baptism as a path to social acceptance. More often than not, their efforts were rewarded. There's a myth that Elizabeth I ordered the expulsion of the blackamoors, and it's born out. That's a myth born out of modern assumptions, not reality. The document that calls for that wasn't actually Elizabeth. It was one of a merchant who tried to do it on her behalf. The British Isles was always populated with immigrants, and Black Tudors are just one of a series of different people who arrived. Most English merchants at this time were far more interested in acquiring gold, ivory, anything, you know, that could make them rich from their African counterparts. So they traded with them. And it could be argued that the racialized chattel slavery that developed in colonial America was based on a mindset. It's been argued that racialized chattel slavery that developed in colonial America was based on a mindset imported from England. But the experience of Africans in Tudor and early Stuart England show that slavery was not an inevitable result of Anglo-African encounters. American slavery was instead something that emerged in a very specific economic and social circumstances of the colonies. Following the decimation of the indigenous populations by old world diseases and the intense physical requirements of harvesting lucrative colonial crops, especially sugar, that's what created demand for imported slave labour. This led English merchants to begin transporting enslaved Africans. It's not that the Tudors were morally superior to those who came later. It's merely that in the mid-17th century, there was no market. Until the mid-17th century, there was no market and no profit to be made from slavery. And even when slavery was adopted by the English colonies and the English overtook the Portuguese and Spanish as the world's most successful slave traders, there was never any statutes codifying slavery passed in England. And like the confusion caused in the 16th century, when Africans came to England from southern European countries, where they may be thought of as being legally enslaved, that confusion continued when Englishmen brought home Africans they had legally purchased in the colonies, only to find that they were free once they were in England. So I think you can say that it was more an economic reason for the slave trade than anything else, and the attitudes of the white Europeans changed to accommodate that. And that is it. Thank you. Yay.